Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. I hope that you're all having a wonderful weekend. Today is Sunday, September 27th, and I am very excited for today's show because we're going to be talking about my favorite movie studio. You can probably guess what it is. I'm a 20-something film student. So it would be A24. We're going to talk about A24 today because the first movie that I watched this week is not brand new, but it did come out earlier this year, something that I missed right away. It was supposed to come to theaters, obviously around March, April, I believe. It was eventually released on digital, and that's called First Cow. It's kind of the big A24 release as far as I'm aware. I think there's a couple others for sure, but this was one of the big ones that they were marketing fairly heavily online. And so then my second movie this week, my weekly watch, is an A24 movie that I have been wanting to watch for a very long time. It is on Netflix, so I figured this would be a good time to watch Good Time. That came spontaneously. I didn't even try to do that. That was right off the dome. So I watched Good Time, and then my final movie is my weekly recommendation. So I decided I would recommend maybe a lesser-known A24 movie, one that does not get nearly as much hype as it should, and we're moving into the October season, into the horror movie season, so I'm going to be talking about Green Room. I know I almost did Hereditary, which is probably my favorite horror movie from them, but it's pretty big, it's pretty popular, so is Midsommar, even though that one is not necessarily my favorite. Green Room isn't a full horror movie, it's much more of a thriller, but it definitely has some horror tropes, some pretty intense violence, and I love it. It's a great movie, so I wanted to talk about it. And then finally, I figured we would cap off the episode with a history of A24. We're just going to talk about what the company is. So if you've never heard of it, or if you have heard of it, just don't know what the background is. A lot of this I didn't know either, so I wanted to do some research on it, and we're going to talk about the history of A24. So that's the episode, one that I am very heavily anticipating talking about, and let's get started. Alright, so the first movie that we're talking about today is First Cow. This is an A24 produced movie, a movie that came out earlier this year. It is currently available to rent for $2.99 on Amazon. That's where I watched it, and I'm sure it's also available to rent on like iTunes, things like that, anywhere you would rent movies, probably for roughly the same price. And usually I like to do my own synopsis, but I was looking at the synopsis to figure out when this took place, and I feel bad. I should know United States history more than I do as far as like Western history is concerned. So I'm not 100% sure when this takes place. It's like the 1800s, at sometime in the 1800s, so please don't get mad at me. But there's a lot to kind of unpack in this movie. It's not necessarily a clear shot premise from the beginning of the movie, especially from the trailer, so I figured I would just read A24's description of the movie. And so the description, the synopsis, is a loner and cook has traveled west and joined a group of fur trappers in Oregon Territory, although he only finds connection with the Chinese immigrant. The men collaborate on a business, although its longevity is reliant upon the participation of a wealthy landowner's prized milking cow. So, it's a pretty original premise. This is not something that I had ever seen before. Obviously, this is a pretty original story, which I was very excited about. I was pretty excited for this movie. This is before anything happened, any quarantine, COVID-related things. I was still anticipating it because it was supposed to come out in March. And I'm really I heavily anticipate pretty much every A24 release. And this one I mean, the title is pretty intriguing. First Cow, it had a pretty good poster, it had a pretty good trailer, but I didn't want to know anything about it. I knew kind of when, actually I didn't know when it took place. I just knew that it was a period piece, as you could tell from earlier in my description of the movie. But I knew like a little bit about it. I knew the setting overall, and I knew that a cow was involved, but I didn't know how. So I'm not going to say that I was pleasantly surprised with this movie, because I kind of had zero expectations going into it. If anything, I didn't like it as much as maybe I wanted to. I didn't dislike it by any means. I think it is a very well-made movie. I think if I'm being completely honest, I probably just was not in the right mindset to watch this movie. It's a very slow burn of a movie. I wouldn't say there's little dialogue, but in every scene there are big chunks, big moments of no dialogue. So it's just a very quiet, slow movie. And I was not kind of ready for this movie on the night that I watched it. So I think that's probably feeds into how I felt about it overall. But I do think it is a very well-made movie, and so I want to talk about everything, obviously, but I want to talk about the things that I like, because pretty much everything that I will say in this are things that I like. There are not a lot of downsides to this movie other than maybe the pacing of it, and even that is based on personal preference, or I really like slow movies, so just kind of whatever mood I'm in. But starting with the performances, there's basically two lead characters played by John Magaro and Orion Lee, and they are fantastic together. They have wonderful chemistry, first of all, so they carry the bulk of this movie. They don't meet right away. In fact, their meeting is pretty chance in the beginning of the movie, and then when they're reunited, that's when their friendship starts to hold more weight as far as the actual narrative of the movie. And I say friendship, but I think it is supposed to be implied that there is some sort of romantic feeling between these two, and if not, it's kind of there in the subtext, at least for me. That's how I interpreted it, and given obviously the time that this movie takes place, that's not something that would be accepted, and so it makes sense that they might not confront it to each other. But so this is a little less acting, this is more screenplay things. I think if anything, it's not even really a critique. It's just kind of a personal preference. I would have wanted that romance to be a bit more explicit. I think that would have made the story a bit more interesting. I feel like it would have had a little bit more stakes. And I know that that's already kind of there. It's kind of the subtext. But it is very subtle if that's the case. Because I'm even doubting it being the case. I think the book ending of the beginning and the ending, I think, kind of solidify that feeling for me. And definitely some of the moments in their relationship. But I would have wanted it just to be a little bit more explicit. Just have a little bit of chemistry, a little bit of romance. They don't need to kiss or anything, or maybe they do. That would also be kind of nice. But I just would have really appreciated a romance between these two characters in this time setting. I think that would have been really, really nice. And even though we don't get that, I do think that it is a wonderful relationship. So the chemistry is definitely there. And I will say that if anything, the performances spoke to me in a way that was very powerful. So they're not trying to get any sort of message across, at least explicitly, to my own interpretation. So powerful isn't necessarily me saying that they're really good at giving you this feeling or whatever. I just think that they have a really quiet intensity in their performances. So most of the performance is quiet. It's very soft. The whole movie is kind of slow, but there are those scenes where no one's really talking and you get just to see them just kind of experience the world or do things in the world. And so particularly John Magaro, his character is more so like this, that he just doesn't really say anything. He's a lot more reserved. And I think within that type of a performance, and definitely Orion Lee's character in the beginning of the movie, he kind of comes out of his shell a bit more towards the middle end of the movie. But there's just this element to both of their performances that kind of draw you in a way that's not telling you, watch me. It's just you are really fixated on their performance. And even though it was kind of slow and I wasn't necessarily in the mood for the movie at the time that I watched it, I was still very invested in the story. I was not bored watching it, realistically speaking, for most of it. I feel like that has to do a lot with their performances, and so I really commend them for that, because it also feels very natural. I said this with Driveways. I think Driveways is probably a bit more natural than these two But it's hard to compare. I'm not trying to compare the two movies. I just think Driveways is better. That's just my own feeling on the movies. But I think that every decision they make in this movie feels natural. I think it also helps when I watch a movie with two actors that I'm not very familiar with. So it just feels like I know them from this. I'm not trying to see them elsewhere. And so because of that, it just feels like a performance or a character that would exist in the world of the film and in the world of just where the film takes place. And speaking of actors that I do know from elsewhere, Toby Jones is in this movie. I really like Toby Jones. He does a lot of motion capture things. He's in a lot of like very high budget nerdy movies. You might know him as Dobby the House Elf. But he's really great in this. I knew what he looks like. Obviously, I've seen him in a few things, but I think sometimes people like this who are big in the industry for doing one thing obviously can get typecast as different things, and so it's nice to see him in a performance that's pretty up and down, pretty nuanced. So he has different elements to his performance in ways that command respect in certain scenes, but then also ones where it's just kind of vulnerable in a very masculine, aggressive way. And so I think he really pulls that performance off. And then we get into the screenplay. Like I said, very slow. A little bit of a slow burn here, but the stakes do rise really nicely. It starts out in kind of a pretty low stakes environment, even though there's a little bit of tension in the beginning, and then we kind of abandon that whole storyline just to confront us with the characters, and then we get into the real meat of the story, and even then we start to kind of rise, not exponentially, pretty gradually as far as the stakes go. But I will say, which is a little bit different than most movies, because this is not the kind of feeling that this movie is trying to convey, you don't really get a sense of stakes or intensity as the stakes are rising. Like, I never really felt like if you're trying to watch a movie that still has emotional weight and some sort of narrative stakes, but you don't want to feel nervous or anxious during it, this would be the one. The filmmaking doesn't set you up in a way where you're necessarily concerned or in suspense, which that might not be a ringing endorsement, but I think it really works for this movie. We're just much more focused on kind of the progression of these characters. And we definitely care about the characters, but I just think that the way the film is done, that's just not the kind of movie that it is. We're not trying to up the stakes in a way that keeps the audience on edge. So I thought that was a really interesting way to pull this off, and it works really well. And it's not something that I've experienced realistically. I mean, I'm sure there are movies where I have, but nothing comes to mind. So I think that's really excellent. And obviously the story is really cute. It's pretty simple, and I love stories that are just very, very simple, and we get to kind of sit with the characters. And in this we do. There are a lot of scenes where there's not really any dialogue, and they're just kind of doing their thing. And the scenes that do have dialogue, all of that dialogue just feels very necessary. And so I'm really glad that there are moments, or there's not even just moments, that there's a good chunk of this screenplay is just us getting to experience the world alongside these characters. So then we get into the production design, which believability is a very important thing here. It's not only an important thing with the acting, but this is a period piece, and so we want to make sure that everything feels natural, feels believable, and in this it does. There's a lot of historical research and context that went into this movie, and that really shows. But it's also not something that kind of takes away from it. Sometimes period pieces can be glossy, maybe the word. It's just kind of flashy in the way that it shows off, oh, look at how great these costumes are, or look at how beautiful these sets are. And that can be a really nice thing in certain movies, but in this one, it's just much more about the characters, obviously, and somewhat of the story. So the costumes and the setting really add to this, and it adds to the overall believability while still not calling attention to itself. And then I also think that part of that is because the entirety of the cinematography and the production design kind of comes second to the setting. So this will obviously feed into a little bit of the cinematography that I just mentioned, but the setting is really important here, and the setting kind of serves as its own character. The wilderness and the woods are just a part of this story. It's very natural, and both thematically and just sort of aesthetically, and so it's really important to have the feeling of the outdoors, feeling of the woods, and so having the production design accent that with the characters' costumes and things, and then also the cinematography does that really well, because the cinematography has these really wonderful exterior shots. They're really gorgeous of just trees and and like woodlands and rivers and mountains, and so it just feels very much like nature. This is the feeling that this movie's trying to give you. And then I'll say there's a really nice balance in this, that even though the setting is a really important part of it, sometimes in movies that have these really large scoped settings, really beautiful images, when a character exists in that frame, it kind of dwarfs them. It makes them feel very small, and we're really supposed to focus on whatever the natural landscape is. In this is not the case. The characters are really the focal point in any shot, ultimately, with a character and a landscape in it, which really has a wonderful balance as far as what we're supposed to be focusing on and the themes of the story. And then cinematography-wise, I'm a big fan of 4:3 ratio. I know that it can be kind of artsy. Maybe it feels pointless at times, but I think it works here. Maybe not as well as if the movie had been set in like the 50s, I guess. But 4:3, for those of you who are wondering, it's basically a square. So the black lines, instead of being on the tops and bottom of your screen, they would be vertical on the sides of your screen. So it makes it look like it's a big boxy television. And that tends to happen in movies where it wants you to feel nostalgic. It wants it to feel old. And this one feels old. So even though it's not nostalgic, because none of us were probably alive during this, it does give it that kind of sense of timelessness in a way. And so I do think that it works in that sense. Also, it's kind of aesthetic. So I'm a big fan of that. So editing, I think the pacing is really nice here if you know what you're in for, because the stakes continue to rise while still being slow. It is paced pretty well. It's just that if you're not in the mood for this kind of movie, it's not going to work for you. So maybe the pacing was a bit too slow for me, but on a second watch, that might not be the case, because I think the thing that frustrated me the most at times is that the scenes feel really long. So even though the movie is not all that long, there are just scenes that potentially feel redundant. Like we already know the events that are going to transpire because we've seen a similar scene before, or we know sort of how the characters are feeling. Like anything that's established character-wise, we've already learned or whatever. So I think the scenes can feel sometimes long, which makes the whole thing feel a bit long, and that kind of adds to the slow, methodical nature of it. But again, even those really intense scenes also feel slow, so that is very intentional for this movie. So I will give it that. And then with the sound, I thought that the score was really gorgeous because it has this kind of old American sound, which is obviously kind of what this movie is trying to go for. But there's a really nice theme in this movie. It kind of accents scenes. I think, again, first watch, so I can't necessarily say this with any sort of like authority, but I think it's kind of supposed to accent their relationship between the two of them. That it tends to kind of come at pivotal points in their relationship between the two of them, and it's just kind of like this 3 or 4 note chord or rhythm. No, not rhythm. Melody. There we go. This little 3 or 4 note melody, and I just think it's a really nice accent. It's pretty memorable, so I thought that was a really solid addition that was not necessary. You could have easily just done a pretty kind of simple, beautiful score that it already has, but then it has that theme that you're able to register, which sometimes you only register in, I don't know, bigger budget movies that want you to focus on specific characters at specific times, and it's subtle in that way. So anyway, really happy that was the case. I love musical themes. And then the directing. So this movie is directed by Kelly Reichardt, who this is the first movie that I have seen by her. It seems as though she has been working as an indie filmmaker for quite a long time, so she seems to have a lot under her belt, but this is kind of the big one that I think is getting a lot of press around it, and she does a wonderful job. I think there's a lot of really technical skill that is in this movie, given just how intentional all of those choices feel. I also love directors who focus on character. Like, this movie is a character-driven film, and that's why it feels so impactful, even in ways that are slow. Like, even if you might not be invested in the story, which I think the story sets itself up as something that you should be invested in, you're still involved with these characters, and particularly the bond between those two. And there's just a lot of subtlety in this movie, whether it be those themes or the characters or the way that the production design doesn't call attention to itself, or the little musical accents that you might not even notice throughout the film. I just think that there's a lot of nuance that this would definitely benefit from a second watch. And then finally, I want to just say a little spoilery thing that I really liked about the movie. So if you don't want any spoilers, it's not a huge spoiler. It is the end of the movie, but this is not the kind of movie that has a huge kind of like twist ending, obviously. So, but if you don't want that, I would say skip about a minute ahead. But I loved the book ending of the beginning and the end. Because I know the beginning feels a little bit out of place at first because it takes place in modern day, and the skeletons kind of add for this eerie, I don't know, sense of dread. But then you kind of know when this movie's going to end. The ending kind of comes out of nowhere because it doesn't feel as though the story has concluded, but then given their position, and then that kind of implies the romance between the two of them, potentially dying together there. So I thought that was really, really beautiful. I think that it comes full circle really nicely. It's a way that emphasized that beginning that doesn't make it feel unnatural, and I was wondering why that beginning was in there, and then it really works at the end. So I just kind of loved that. Also, the woman there is Alia Shawkat, who is in a lot of stuff but does not get nearly the credit that she deserves. So I thought it was fun to see her. She's in one of my favorite horror satires, The Final Girls. She's also in another movie on this list, Green Room, and you also might know her as maybe Funke from Arrested Development. So I thought it was really fun to see her. So speaking of Green Room, oh wait, I got to give my rating for this movie. I'm going to give this movie a soft 8 out of 10. Strong 7 out of 10, maybe a strong or solid 7 out of 10 for me, but overall I would give it a soft 8 out of 10. A very strong movie, very subtle, and ultimately just a very, very beautiful movie. I do love movies like this, so very glad that I watched it. If you want to check it out, it is available to rent on most services where you can rent movies. And okay, back to my really bad segue. Green Room is going to be another movie that I talk about, but first I'm going to be talking about Good Time, then comes Green Room, and then stay tuned until the very end where I talk about my it's not a top 5 this week. Sorry, I got excited. I could have done my top 5 A24, but I think I've talked about all of them in the past. So we're going to talk about the history of A24 instead. But that's the episode. So right now we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around, I have just given my review of First Cow. Now I'm going to be talking about my weekly watch, which was Good Time, and finally my weekly recommendation of Green Room. Make sure you stick around to the very end where I talk about the history of A24. But right now, a very popular A24 movie called Good Time. This is a movie from 2017, directed by Josh and Benny Safdie, also known as the Safdie brothers. It stars Benny Safdie and Robert Pattinson, as well as a slew of other semi-cameos, I would say. Glorified cameos. But this movie basically follows two brothers after a botched bank robbery. One of the two gets arrested, and that one just so happens to have a pretty severe learning or social disability, and so the other brother, played by Robert Pattinson, has to find a way to get his brother out of jail in a bunch of wacky and fun ways. This movie, if you know anything about the Safdie brothers, so I don't know a ton. I know this movie and I know Uncut Gems, which is also them, so that might be why you have heard of them. They like to have a good time with their movies. All right, that's the last one. I'm sorry. They really go heavy on taboo topics, as well as just a cringeworthy moments. It just really kind of shows the underbelly of human nature in specific ways. And this movie is no different. I'm going to be completely honest with you guys. There is a good chunk of this movie that I really did not feel like I could stomach. Not in like like in a gross way, but not in like it's not gory. That's not what I mean. It's just kind of dirty and gross and disgusting, and I didn't like looking at it. So, okay, that's that out of the way. But I did ultimately enjoy this movie. I don't think I enjoyed it as much as I wanted to just because of those moments, and that doesn't make the movie bad by any means. It's just a personal preference, was not something that I enjoyed watching, and so because of that, it lowered a little bit for me personally, but it is a very well-made movie. I also really appreciate what the Safdie brothers are doing. Obviously, I love directors with a very clear vision. They have a very distinct style, and this movie is no exception to that, and their style kind of shines through. And so we're going to just talk about the movie itself, because I did ultimately really enjoy it, despite some of those, prohibitors for me from enjoying it. But first, the acting. Robert Pattinson. Oh my god. Robert Pattinson is so good. He's such a good leading man. Little spoiler for next episode. I think I'm going to be watching Twilight, which I've never seen, and I think he's bad in that one, but he has really come around since then. He just has a knockout performance in a way that a lot of times, like, really good performances get marketed as, like, really intense characters, really difficult characters to portray, whether it be a historical character or... it's usually a historical character or a character who just goes through a lot of trauma, a lot of strife. And in this one, that is kind of the case. He definitely goes through a lot of emotional labor in here, but it is kind of just a movie where he's being a guy, and he's not really coping with a bunch of the emotion or turmoil that he's going through, which is also one of the themes of the movie for sure. But because he's not addressing the emotion of his character, all of that kind of has to be in the layers of his performance. And that really shows. He also gets to kind of show off in ways where he's playing different characters to different people in the world of the film. And so you get to see the range that he has there, which I thought was really fantastic. And you can tell how much time he took to kind of develop those characters and, well, ultimately just kind of develop his main character that then kind of offshoots into those other ones. So he kind of gets to change up the performance throughout the movie, which makes, this movie doesn't get boring, don't get me wrong, but his performance never gets stale or dull because he's always switching it up. I also think Benny Safdie is amazing in this. So he's one of the directors, and he plays the brother that has that disability, which is not something that he has himself. And so he really does it in a respectful way that feels accurate to, at least in my experience. This is not something that I have a ton of experience with. So please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. You can tweet at GSMC_movies. I haven't plugged that in a little bit, but he just does a really great job in a way that feels really respectful, but also feels genuine to the story and the character. And I don't know, there's just some really... You can just see that his brain is working in every scene that he's in, because he doesn't really get to articulate his feelings unless it's like he's overly articulating it or just kind of like simply articulating it. So most of the time he's kind of quiet and reserved. And so you kind of got to see those gears working, which somehow you do, which is, I don't know, I view these two as directors. And so getting to see this performance kind of knocked me out, kind of really stuck with me. And then I mentioned earlier that they're kind of cameos, but there are some pretty big names, or not huge names, but like Jennifer Jason Leigh is in this movie, Barkhad Abdi's in this, and so I expected them to be a more significant player, which they're significant in terms of the story, but they just don't get a lot of screen time, so that's why I would say they're kind of glorified cameos, but we do get a lot of depth from their characters. They have very distinct personalities, and they don't necessarily just have they're not one-dimensional or they're not two-dimensional. They actually have something going on within the story and with their performance. So I think that they do really add something to the film, even if they're not in it for all that long. The screenplay, I mentioned in the last review that the escalation is kind of gradual in First Cow. In this one, it is exponential. Once it kicks off, it kicks off. So this is kind of something that I'm going to be mentioning a couple times probably, but the Safdie brothers are absolutely relentless. Like, they do not give you a chance to breathe. That's something that's the case with Uncut Gems. That's something that's the case here. It's just like, once there's something that's difficult to watch, cringy to watch, you might get rid of that moment, but you're gonna get another moment in like 5 minutes. Like, it is just point after point after point where it's just characters like digging the hole deeper for themselves, which is obviously kind of a genre in and of itself. Characters that have no idea what they're doing and are trying to fix their situation but are only making it worse. And I think the Safdie brothers have kind of perfected it in a way that makes the audience feel the same as the character. The entire world and the world of the film is just crumbling in on them. So for that, great job. Definitely hard to watch. I'm not a huge fan of cringe stuff. I cringe very hard with the characters, and that's the case here. I actually, I ran away from the TV at one point. My roommate was on FaceTime with a friend, and I like ran into her room, and like I was like, I can't watch the TV right now. I gotta like I kept the movie on, and I didn't miss anything that was really important, but I was like, I can't watch this scene. Like, I just physically cannot. I can't stomach it. So they're really good at that. And I think because of that, they always keep you guessing. You never know where the movie's going to take you, because it's always going to take you somewhere worse than you were before. This might not be a ringing endorsement. It's still a really good movie. And if that's something that you might find yourself enjoying, or just kind of like curious to experience it, I'm glad I watched this movie. Don't get me wrong. And I do think it is a very good movie. It's just a little difficult to watch. So I want to make sure that you know that going into the movie. And then kind of my last point on the screenplay, it changes how you feel about the main character pretty quickly. Like, it goes back and forth as to how because it's really a story about Robert Pattinson, ultimately. I mean, there's definitely a lot of like core messages and themes that are going on here, but Robert Pattinson is the bulk of the movie, and it's really a piece about him, and it keeps you guessing throughout the entire movie as to like, or not guessing, I used the wrong word there. It just keeps you on your toes as to like how you feel about this main character. So sometimes I really liked him. I thought he was doing a good thing, and then sometimes very much the other way around. And I think by the end of the movie, there's kind of a clear decision on how the movie wants to make you feel, but there's also a little bit of ambiguity there. So you feel like you know how you're supposed to feel about Robert Pattinson, but then there's a little bit of doubts in your mind. And then I really like that final scene. It's over the credits. It's kind of like a supplement or complimentary scene to the movie, and I think that really hammers home some of those points, especially for Benny Safdie's character. So then we're going to go into production design, which this is kind of, I would say, a perfect example of what you want from production design, because it's something that feels natural in the world, and it doesn't feel out of place by any means, but all of it is, or this is mainly the costuming, by the way, which I'm going to talk about first. It's natural, nothing ever takes you out of it, but it is distinct enough to be memorable. So I remember what Robert Pattinson's character looked like. I remember what Benny Safdie's character looked like, or the clothes that they were wearing. I think the masks in the beginning of the movie are pretty distinct. You know exactly what they look like. So everything feels like it fits in the world of the film, and it doesn't take you out of it by being too outlandish, but it is kind of creative, original enough that you're going to remember it. So it's the perfect blend of what you want from production design. And then I also think that the sets are also really original and memorable in ways that change up the movie, because it feels very diverse. Like, there's a diverse amount of locations, from worn down areas outside to, I think they go to it's like a Pizza Hut or Domino's. Yeah, maybe it's a Domino's. The product placement didn't really work here because I don't remember which one it is. And there's an amusement park and just like a house and a hospital. Like, they go, and a jail. They go everywhere in this film. And so that really switches things up as far as the movie goes. It's always moving, which is something that the story is doing as well. But then the sets are just super memorable, and you can kind of do a lot of creative things with how the characters interact with the set and how you shoot it. And then speaking of how you shoot it, the cinematography. The cinematography is one of the most interesting things about this movie. So I'm going to mention Uncut Gems for a second if you haven't seen it. But Uncut Gems does this thing where... sorry, a lot to say about this. I said earlier that the Safdie brothers are really relentless. They never kind of give you a chance to breathe. They might give the characters a chance to take a little bit of a break. There might not be a lot of intense dialogue or a lot of people chasing them at that moment. So that's really nice. That's what you want. You want to give some time to the characters so we can understand the characters, but they never give the audience a chance to breathe. And they do this in a couple different ways. Some of it is the stakes of the film. Some of it is just how they keep changing things up. But one of it is how they make the movie itself. So in Uncut Gems, at least for the first 40 minutes, there's not a single moment of silence. So in every scene, there's like people talking in the background or a television on or a score or people yelling at each other. It's just constant use of sound to feel very claustrophobic. And then they do the same thing in Good Time, but with cinematography. Specifically in the beginning is where I noticed it. It kind of took a little bit of a backseat towards the middle end of the movie. But in the beginning of the movie, most of it is shot in close-ups. So you really don't get a chance to see the exterior of the scene. You don't get to breathe in a way where you know the surroundings. You don't know the surroundings. You're only getting to see how the characters are looking at things, how they're responding to things. So in that way, it feels very claustrophobic in those close-ups. And so that's one of the ways that the Safdie brothers make sure that you are always on edge as a viewer. And then, of course, the cinematography, much like the editing, is very fast-paced. So there are a couple different scenes where characters will be running or moving around, and the camera moves with them. It feels very natural, but it also feels very chaotic, which is important for this movie. And then the editing feels chaotic as well. It's always moving. There are no breaks. Every scene feels like it's getting cut off at the right time, if not too early. We're moving places, and before we even know that we've moved to that place, and the editing just keeps up the pacing, whereas the editing in the scene is still slow enough that it doesn't feel clunky in any way. The scene works in a way that's paced really nicely, but then moving from place to place, it's just very quick and very sporadic. The score here, there's a pretty distinct techno score, electronic-inspired score, which is not, I wouldn't say it's like an unobvious choice, but it's not the obvious choice. It's an inspired decision. I know, I hate myself for saying that as well. It's just a decision that isn't necessarily your first choice, but it works really well here to exemplify the chaotic nature of our main character, and then it also adds to the intensity of every single scene. And so the directing, I kind of mentioned most of the directing when I talked about cinematography, with how they really don't give the viewer a chance to take a breath, and they're just absolutely relentless. Like, it is the movie, like, it just kept on moving in ways where I was like, oh my god, we were here and now we're here. Oh my, like, that's what this movie feels like. And so even though some of the moments might not have been my cup of tea, does not mean it is a bad movie. So I'm going to give this one a solid 7 out of 10. It's probably an even better movie than that. It's probably closer to a strong 8, soft 9. But again, this is my show. This is how I feel about it, and it hurt my stomach at certain points. But I still do recommend it, especially if you're a big film fan or if you liked Uncut Gems. I would say it's a bit more intense than Uncut Gems, so I personally preferred Uncut Gems. But in a similar vein, same directors, and still very well done. So that is Good Time, my weekly watch, and we're going to move right along into my weekly recommendation of Green Room, one of the most underrated A24 movies. And finally, stay tuned until the very end, where I talk about the history of A24. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my reviews of First Cow and Good Time. And now, keeping with the A24 trend, I'm going to be giving my weekly recommendation of Green Room. And then stay tuned until the final segment where I talk about the history of A24. But right now is Green Room. This is a film from 2015. It's directed by Jeremy Saulnier. Yeah, probably. Stars Anton Yelchin, Imogen Potts, and Patrick Stewart. Yeah, Captain Picard's in this one. And it basically follows a punk rock band that's forced to perform at a venue run by neo-Nazis so they can get some money. They are a starving band, and after witnessing a horrific murder in the Green Room, they are trapped in the same room, and death awaits them outside as the neo-Nazis are getting ready to kill them, because otherwise they're going to get ratted out as being actual murderers. So this movie, again, much like the first two, very high concept, very creative premise. A punk band and Nazis in the same movie, and it's kind of a horror movie. Sign me up. I'm already intrigued. So this movie is fantastic. I watched this movie probably right close to when it came out. So 2016 probably. It came out in 2015. And still am. I'm a big fan of the late actor Anton Yelchin. He was one of my favorite young actors at the time, so his death was very tragic. But he does a fantastic job in this movie. And he's pretty much the reason that I watched the movie in the first place. But I'm also a big horror movie fan, which this movie is marketed as a horror movie, but I would say it's less horror movie and much more thriller. It is very violent. It's pretty gory, so I would make sure you know that going into it. But it's not all that scary. There's, I don't know, maybe one or two jump scares, but that can even happen in a non-horror movie. But regardless, it's just a very intriguing premise that is executed pretty perfectly. And it starts with that acting. So like I said, Anton Yelchin is one of my favorites. He's pretty much the lead in this, and he has a really, I would say, subdued performance compared to the rest of the group, because it is a punk rock band, so they are very, not necessarily aggressive, but definitely high energy, and that tends to go across the board for the band, but he is much more laid back and calm, and even when the situation calls for a lot of intensity, he really only does it when, first of all, he has to, or it's gotten so far into the events of the night that he's just completely delusional from shock and probably exhaustion and whatnot. So he gets to show off those chops towards the end of the movie, but he has a pretty quiet performance throughout it, and that tends to carry it in a way that I wasn't really expecting going into this movie, because you'd expect, given the nature of the story, of the idea, a high-energy character is what would carry it, potentially, but because everybody else is so high-energy around him in both positive and negative ways, he actually tends to kind of ground the movie in realism in a really distinct way that I really, really appreciated. So I think that he has such a wonderful performance, and the cast is nuts. So like Patrick Stewart, even though Patrick Stewart probably got like a day rate and came on for like a day or two, he's not in the movie all that much, but his presence is in the movie because he commands absolutely every scene that he's in. He is so menacing, and I think that kind of you can kind of see that in any of his other roles. So his other roles are usually very sympathetic. So Picard, Professor Xavier, like, they're the good guys. They're number one good guy, but you can understand that the amount of respect that most of the characters give him in those movies, and that he kind of just sort of like administers throughout those films, that still translates to this. It's just going the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So getting to see him play that character was so fun to watch. Like, he's just so terrifying. And Imogen Potts also has a really kind of, I don't want to say creepy, but definitely like a very mysterious role in this. And she complements Anton Yelchin's character really nicely, because Anton Yelchin is a pretty subdued, but we know a lot about his character, or at least we get to kind of understand that throughout the first act of the movie, whereas Imogen, we don't know as much about her character, but she is a bit more high energy. So they're pretty good foils to each other as both the they're both kind of the main two protagonists. And so she has a really knockout performance. Then also Alia Shawkat's in this too, and she is one of the band members. The entire band, I should probably mention that just the band has really strong chemistry with each other because the movie has very little exposition. So there's not a ton of like expository dialogue of what we should know going into it. It's snuck in there in a really nice way. So there's like an interview in the beginning of the movie, so we get to kind of understand where they're coming from. But all of the characters speaking to each other, it feels like this is what they would say without somebody watching them. So even if there's a little bit of like exposition and background knowledge that we learn, it's something that would make sense for that character to be saying at this time. So that kind of what comes to mind is that opening or in the beginning of the movie when we find out why they're going to this very dangerous, bigoted club. And so that feels like a very natural exchange of dialogue, even though it is pretty expository. So that just adds to the chemistry, but the chemistry is already there. The characters interact with each other really nicely, especially the kids. And in those scenes where they have to like get out there and kind of, I don't know, run the show, they gotta kill some people, and they're just kind of going wild. You see that shine there the most because even though the characters are not having fun, you can really tell that the actors are having fun with a scene like that. So then mentioning the expository or the non-expository nature of the dialogue, we can go into the screenplay. So super creative premise, that's what drew me in, other than Anton Yelchin, so the high concept is there. But it also serves as just sort of the backdrop. It's like, here's the premise, this is it. It's very simple. It's a pretty short movie. It's like an hour 30, hour 40, and it just uses its premise to the max. It basically just is like, here's the premise. We're not going to change it up anyway, but we are going to kind of use every aspect of that premise to our advantage. And that's kind of how the film works. It just uses it in a way that feels very necessary. And then because there isn't all that much exposition, all of the dialogue feels very necessary. Nothing feels out of place. So whether it's to build the world of the story, to build the character, or give us a little bit of background knowledge, even though it's pretty good at doing that, pretty subtle at doing that, all of that dialogue feels extremely necessary. And I think one of my favorite aspects of the screenplay is that there's some really fantastic juxtaposition between the neo-Nazis trying to kill them outside of the room and then the kids inside of the room. So the Nazis are organized, structured, disciplined. They know what they have to do, and they are good at doing it, whereas the kids are completely out of their element. They have no idea what they're doing. They are terrified. They're in shock. So then they act irrationally, which works extremely well in a movie like this, where it's a horror movie where you want to, or you don't want to see some dumb decisions, but it makes sense. That's the trope here, and it justifies it in a way where they have no idea what they're doing, and they're also under an unreal amount of stress, and so they're really just trying to survive. So it makes sense when those decisions happen. So then let's get into the production design. The production design is my favorite because if this falls under production design, which I believe it would, I guess it kind of falls under, I don't know, cinematography maybe. The violence in this is amazing. I know that might feel a little bit like gross to say, but I think there is definitely an art to good movie violence, and it is totally here. It is raw. It is like raw in the grossest way possible. It's completely unorganized. Like, it's just messy. Like, violence is not structured. It is not supposed to be clean and pristine. If you get punched in the face, it's not going to create this perfect circle around your eye. It's going to be gross and bloody, and it's going to hurt. And you feel everything that happens in this movie. There's one particular one that stands out where a character is like getting his arm started to get sawed off by a box cutter, and that then persists throughout the rest of the movie. Because another pet peeve of mine is when something happens to a character that would hurt or sustain in a way, be prolonged, and then it kind of gets abandoned later on. It's like, oh, they're not really injured anymore. This plays a very pivotal part in the rest of the movie, both in the production design, which is kind of memorable with the duct tape, but then also in the actual narrative. So I think the violence is probably the best part of this movie. It's one of the selling points, and it just is top-notch. It's fantastic movie violence. And then with the production design too, I think one of the big things that I kind of mentioned in First Cow, kind of, which isn't really as much the case as it is here, is that the setting is kind of a character. So in First Cow, it's the nature, it's the outdoors. But in this, the club is a character of its own. We get to know kind of every nook and cranny within the building. And then also this story wouldn't work without this building. We get to see the different sides of it, where it's like the kind of brightly lit green room with the dark, dimly lit outside hallways, where we get to kind of see the morality of these characters. And so the setting and that building is really important to the story, and so you get the feeling that through both the production design and the cinematography, it exists as a character in this world. And so then moving on to the cinematography, there's a really intense color palette in this movie, and you can probably guess it's green. I think that can kind of be taken up for interpretation, because obviously colors have symbolism involved with them, and so in this one, green is supposed to be, it can kind of go back and forth. A lot of times it's like envy, jealousy, or greed. But I think here it's kind of the lack of clear-cut morality. It's just, there's not really any sort of good, bad associated with green, at least to my minor understanding of color theory. So it's sort of supposed to be this kind of like ambiguous movie in the way that characters are acting and the violence that kind of takes place with these different characters. So I think the green symbolizes that in a really solid way. And then also the low light. And I'm just always impressed when a movie can shoot really well in low light. You can see everything going on, and then when you can't see certain things, it's for a reason. It's hiding it from you for a very important purpose. But it also kind of adds depth. So I mentioned the kind of juxtaposition between the morality of the characters, the light and the dark. And so then having a lot of scenes take place in the low light makes the violence a lot more shocking. It adds to the suspense of things. And so I think that it's shot really well in low light, and having a lot of it be in low light actually adds to the importance of the story. So with the editing, this is also kind of a slower, methodical movie. If you're into intense action or violence, you're going to get that, but in very small increments. It's not consistent throughout it. It's more of it's not really a character piece, because there's enough characters that we're not focused on one, but it's a movie just about survival. It's like self-preservation, ultimately. And so we get to kind of see the characters grapple with the situation. And so it kind of feels like it's almost taking place in real time. It like, in terms of movie real time, you can kind of make the argument that it is a movie in real time, because so few movies actually do that. So obviously there are movies that do take place in real time. If we're talking about A24, Locke would be one of them. I mentioned that a couple weeks ago, or last week, whatever. But this is basically real time. It ultimately takes place over one night, and so a lot of the scenes that play out between the band within the green room or the Nazis outside of it are like more or less full conversations. They don't seem to be edited down in any way, and so it feels like it's taking place in real time, which makes it even scarier, because we don't know when things are going to happen, and we kind of are lulled into this false sense of security for a lot of it. And then when they go out, we get these really brief bouts of like intense violence, which I think just adds to like the overall feeling of this movie, where it's like we don't know when any of this is going to happen. It kind of reflects how they feel about music as well, where it's like really intense and raw for a little bit, and then it goes away. And that's kind of how the violence works in this movie as well. So I think it complements it in a story way, but then also it adds to the pacing in a way that's really effective. So in the sound, punk rock is just the perfect sound for this movie. This is a movie about aggression and anger and violence, and so this is the sound that you want for the movie. And so I know that it's a part of the story, so it's important that it's a part of the story, but I also just think that it serves the story thematically in a way that sound should and music should, and so it is just excellent in here. And so then we go on to the directing. So this director likes to do a lot of movies like this. He has a trilogy by a name that I cannot say on this podcast, but he likes to do movies that are really intense and grapple with characters' morality and kind of show characters at their wits' end and what they would do in a survival scenario, to kind of make the audience reflect and think, maybe what would you do? And so it's really intense in that way, but then it's also somewhat subdued. He's not just doing it in a way that's like, is a term called torture porn, so it's not in that sort of way where it's like, we're just going to watch it as a form of catharsis. Like, it's actually effective So it's not like mindless. You're not watching it and you don't become desensitized to it. You're really on edge throughout most of it, but that's because of the fact that he dials it back. He knows when to use it. And so I think in that way, it's directed really brilliantly. So I love this movie. It does not get talked about nearly enough when it comes to A24. My favorite A24 movie obviously is Ex Machina, but I've already talked about that on the podcast. So talking about Green Room is something that I'm super excited to do because it is just such a good A24 movie. So I'm going to give this one a strong 9 out of 10. I love Green Room. If you're a big fan of thrillers, of violence, of horror, of just good cinema, Green Room is for you. So that's Green Room. That's the end of my movie list for the day. But right now we're going to talk about the history of A24. But first, our final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my reviews of First Cow, Good Time, and Green Room. And so you can tell it's a very A24 episode, so I'm going to talk about the history of A24. This is something that I was excited to learn about because I don't know a ton about the history of the film company, but it is my favorite film company right now. I think they are making some of the most creative, original stories, and so I love going to see their movies. So let's talk about where they came from. So A24, unlike a lot of major film studios, well, first of all, it's not a major film studio, but unlike a lot of the studios you might see in front of some of your favorite movies, it is a very new production company. And it started solely as a film distribution company in 2012. It was started by Daniel Katz, John Hodges, and David Finkel. They were kind of a part of the industry. They had a lot of experience. They decided to start this distribution company, so it's not like a startup. It didn't really come out of nowhere. But part of the mission statement of this company was to create and sell stories with a distinctive point of view. And so this is an independent film distributor, and so I want to clarify. So actually, this is kind of skipping ahead a little bit, but in 2018, they became a production company, a full production company, but they started out as solely a distribution company. So let's talk about what the difference between that is. So a distribution company, well, okay, first, you're going to see both distribution companies and production company logos in front of any movie that you watch. So whoever produced it, whoever distributed it, those logos are going to be in front of the movie. But the thing that distinguishes it is a distribution company comes in at the end of a movie. So a movie's already done, it's being screened places, and that's the company that's going to get it into theaters, get it into your homes. And so a lot of A24 movies were movies that had a lot of critical success and probably premiered at a lot of the premier film festivals. So think Sundance, Toronto International, Tribeca, South by Southwest, Cannes, Venice, just a lot of those really popular film festivals that get a lot of critics and a lot of fans to see those movies. So distribution companies will find those movies, see which ones they think they can sell, and then start to market it to a wider audience when they decide to distribute it. So that's what A24 did at first. And they tend to pick movies that are very low budget. A lot of their movies are like under $5 million, which obviously sounds like a lot of money, but films like big budget films or films with a solid budget tend to be at least $20 million, and then if you go with a high budget, you go upwards of 200 million at times. So 5 million is a very low budget in terms of these things. And they're independent movies. And the first movie that kind of puts A24 on the map in 2014 or 2013 was Spring Breakers. So you might have heard about this movie. I think I might have mentioned it on the podcast before. I haven't reviewed it. This is a movie that I really like. It's one of those movies that got kind of marketed. So it's funny that I'm talking about the marketing because it was A24, but it kind of got marketed as sort of this like dumb party movie, but which is a really great way to sell it, first of all. But I think a lot of people were disappointed because that's not really what it is. It's a much like deeper, weirder piece about like vices in general. And so I love Spring Breakers. I think it's a great movie, super underrated. I can review it if you guys are curious. If you want me to talk about it, I might end up reviewing it at some point. But that's the first one that kind of put A24 on the map. And I think that has to do with the fact that there were a lot of big names in the movie, a lot of big names for younger people. So Ashley Benson, who was in Pretty Little Liars, Selena Gomez, Vanessa Hudgens, both of those were Disney Channel stars. And then James Franco played a very theatrical character that is somewhat based off of a famous is a loose term, successful, I guess, rapper named Riff Raff. So he's kind of based on that, and so he's a very eccentric character. And a lot of the marketing had to do with that, had to do with him. There was also a lot of digital marketing for this movie, and then also subsequently all of the rest of A24 movies, so it got a general fan base, or just a younger fan base of film fans, so teens, college students, people in their 20s, and that tends to be A24's primary market as it is, because they do a lot of digital marketing. It's basically 95% digital marketing. In fact, my favorite digital marketing that they've done, which I just found out today in learning about A24 and like looking at the history of A24, is when Ex Machina premiered, which is one of my favorite movies. It premiered at South by Southwest, and a Tinder profile was created for Ava, the AI robot in the movie, and it would respond to you if you matched with it. And it was like this weird kind of AI bot thing in sort of this guerrilla marketing way to market this movie, which is absolutely genius and so creative. And that's a lot of where their marketing lies. It's just a very creative, very digital, and that's sort of what they do. And so speaking of Ex Machina is actually the first movie that won them an Oscar in 2015. It won an Oscar for visual effects, which I was extremely happy with. I watched that one live. I remember that one because I think that was probably the first year, maybe the second year, where I did like a full Oscar ballot where I like made guesses. And I'm pretty sure it was up against Force Awakens. Age of Ultron might have been a year earlier. Definitely a Marvel movie. A Marvel movie had to have been there. Guardians of the Galaxy, maybe. It was up against these Jurassic World, I think. It was just up against these like big, high-budget studio VFX movies, and it won. And it was crazy because it just has the visual effects just feel so natural in that movie. And I think it might have been the same Oscar ceremony, even though the movie came out a little bit later. Amy won them an Oscar as well for Best Documentary. They also won an Oscar for Room, which they got nominated a bunch. I think that was their first Best Picture nomination, but obviously Brie Larson won Best Actress for that movie, and then Moonlight won Best Picture for them, so that was their first Best Picture win. First and only Best Picture. And then also, it is the first movie that they produced as well. So like I said, they originally started as just a distribution company, and they have now transitioned into being a production company. So that means that they are usually attached to a movie before it's getting made. So if a distribution company comes at the end of a movie, then a production company comes at the beginning of the movie, or maybe sometimes beginning, middle. It's kind of shaky sometimes. So whether or not they are there from the minute it gets picked up, so if a script is floating around Hollywood or the industry and they think it's interesting and decide to back that financially, they might be at it from the beginning, or a movie already has a director and actors and a script and a location, and it's already set and they need some more financial backing, A24 might come in there. But they still are attempting to pick creative projects that can get wide appeal. They feel like they can market but also really resonate with usually a very specific group of people. It's not supposed to be this wide appeal. It's usually very creator driven. It's something that the creator felt like they had to make. or is just very clearly their vision, and so it might not get this wide appeal that you would get from a Marvel movie or a Star Wars movie. And so that tends to be the movies that they pick, but they pick them because it's a low budget and then they can make a good amount of money based on their viral marketing, as well as their target audience, which tends to be younger. I would say probably like 15 to 30. This is also solely opinion, so don't take this as fact by any means. But I think A24 has a really great grasp of what they know they can market well and also the quality of their films. And so I say this because there is an instance where A24 produced this movie that had kind of gotten a good amount of viral anticipation on Twitter. It was called Slice, and it had this poster, and the premise was like a murderous pizza boy and werewolves. Like, that was it, and which is something that like is going to set you off as being like, oh, that sounds fun, that sounds creative, I'm excited for that. And it also starred Chance the Rapper, and it was like one of the first acting appearances from him. So I was really curious because I was a big fan of him, and his demographic is similar to that of A24. So I was expecting it to be this big thing for A24. But much to my surprise, it only had it had a premiere in a couple different cities across the country at the same time. And one of them happened to be Philadelphia, which is where I live. And so I went because I was very curious about it. And it was not a very good movie. And they had like a digital talkback with the cast in Chicago because that's where the creator's from. That's where Chance the Rapper's from. And then it immediately got released on iTunes, like right after that. It didn't get a theatrical release. It didn't get exclusive streaming rights. It didn't get marketed very heavily. And I think A24 knew that. Like, they knew it wasn't quality or as quality as they wanted it to be. They were on as a producer before the movie had gotten made. And so I guess they saw it and didn't think it was as good. They couldn't market it as heavily. And so they decided to distribute it in a different way. And so I just think that speaks very highly of A24. They know the quality of the movies, and so if you see a movie that is getting promoted very heavily by A24, I think you can anticipate that it's going to be quite good. They've also recently partnered with a bunch of other different companies to get exclusive rights, so that's just going to help them financially to get some extra money for their production company, because sometimes their movies don't do quite as well, because sometimes they're taking a risk based on the premise of some of these movies. And so they have currently partnered exclusively with Amazon and Showtime with some of their movies. So a lot of their movies were on Netflix for a time, and then now they have transitioned to Amazon, and that's because that's how the distribution rights worked. There are still some A24 movies on Netflix, and that's because the distribution rights to that movie has not like run out yet. So I watched Good Time on Netflix. I would anticipate Good Time probably leaving within the next year or so, maybe. I'm not 100% sure on that. And then also the movies get to premiere on Showtime as well. So Amazon and Showtime. They've also signed deals with Apple TV and HBO. So a lot of those movies can be seen on HBO. Apple TV got exclusive streaming rights to Boys State, which I watched earlier. And then also they have started partnering with some of these production companies because they are starting to make television shows, which is very exciting. So they partnered with HBO when they made Euphoria. Euphoria is an excellent television show. I know this isn't a TV podcast, but I love A24 and I also love TV, so I want to talk about it a little bit. Euphoria is an amazing show. It really resonated with people my age because I think it's a really accurate depiction of what high school looks like in this day and age, which if you've seen the show, hopefully that doesn't scare you too much. But I do think it definitely resonated with me because of that. And it also is the target demographic of what A24 is looking for a lot of the time. They also have just bought the rights to a web series. It's a cartoon web series that is completely escaping my memory right now, but it's very popular. And I totally forget. I am so sorry. But another one, I think their final TV show right now is Rami on Hulu, which is a very good show, and nobody talks about it. It's fantastic. So if you haven't checked out Rami and you're interested in television, please check that one out as well. So that's kind of how A24 works right now. If you hadn't heard of them before or are just curious about quality movies, you can always anticipate at least something original from A24, and most of the time it's going to be very good. Whether or not it's your cup of tea, that's a whole different story. But they are an excellent distribution company, an excellent production company, my favorite by far, and I don't think they are going anywhere anytime soon. So check out some A24 movies if you're curious. All three of the movies that I talked about today, I would recommend to different levels. And then obviously Ex Machina, Hereditary, Moonlight are some of my favorites. So please go check those out. I think a lot of them are going to go down in history as some of the defining movies of our generation, without a doubt in my mind. And A24 is probably going to go down as that production company for our generation. So that is the episode. I had a very good time. I love A24, I love these movies, and I love talking about them with you guys. So thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Company. If you could please remember to subscribe to the show if you haven't already, and maybe write us a nice review, because that would really help us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you, and have a good one.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.